Abduction and awakening asterisk. Riley Soren woke to a sharp hum reverberating through her skull, the sound prickling her senses like needles under her skin. Her eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dim, sterile light of her surroundings. The walls of her cell were smooth and metallic, reflecting faint pulses of green and blue as alien symbols danced across a holographic screen in the corner. She wasn't on Earth anymore. The air was cold, carrying an acrid tang that stung her nose. She pushed herself up from the floor, muscles sore and head pounding. Her mind raced to piece together the last thing she remembered. Her unit had been deployed to monitor a suspected alien landing zone. The forest had been dark and still, too still. Then, the blinding light. The air had vibrated, and before she could shout a warning, everything went black. Now, here she was. Not in a lab. Not in an alien zoo, as she'd secretly feared. But something worse, a containment cell. Riley stood, scanning her surroundings with sharp, calculating eyes. She noted the absence of seams in the walls and the faint vibration beneath her feet. A ship. She was moving. Her mind quickly connected the dots. Zicterans, the warlike species that had been making contact with Earth's colonies. Their reputation for kidnapping humans was whispered but never confirmed. Until now. The cell door slid open without warning, a hiss of compressed air announcing the arrival of her captors. Riley stepped back instinctively, her small hands curling into fists as two towering Zicterans entered. Their skin shimmered with a sickly, chitinous green sheen, and their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. One of them clicked its mandibles, and a distorted voice followed, translated through a device strapped to its arm. Subject awake. Small. Weak. Riley's heart pounded, but her expression remained neutral. She didn't flinch, didn't react. Instead, she studied them, their movements, their body language. The Zicterans were taller than she expected, their elongated limbs giving them a spindly, insect-like appearance. One carried a sleek baton that crackled with energy, the other's claws flexed menacingly. Move! The second Zicteran ordered, pointing toward the corridor outside. Riley hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. Complying, for now, was the best option. She needed information, needed to understand where she was and what they wanted. The moment she passed through the threshold, she stole a glance at the corridor, a labyrinth of smooth, glowing walls that seemed to stretch endlessly. They led her through a series of hallways, past other cells. She caught glimpses of other prisoners, humans and alien species alike. Some were unconscious, others staring blankly at the walls. None looked capable of putting up a fight. The guards shoved her into a room that was larger than her cell, the walls lined with holographic monitors displaying data she couldn't immediately decipher. In the center of the room stood a tall, insectoid figure, its exoskeleton adorned with golden accents. This one radiated authority. Ah, the human child, it said, its voice smooth and mocking. Barely worth the effort of capture. Riley met its gaze, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak. Not yet. The Zicteran waved a clawed hand, and one of the guards activated a nearby console. A hologram appeared, displaying Earth's surface. Images of cities, military installations, and human soldiers scrolled past. The Zicteran tilted its head, its mandibles clicking thoughtfully. Your kind is primitive, it said, but adaptable. You will serve well in our experiments. Experiments. The word sent a chill down Riley's spine, but she pushed the fear aside. Focus, she told herself. Panic won't help. She let her gaze drift subtly to the monitors, trying to absorb as much information as possible. What do you want with me? She asked finally, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. The Zicteran turned to her, amused. Questions already? How curious. It leaned closer, its glowing eyes narrowing. You will find out soon enough. Before she could respond, the guards seized her arms and dragged her toward another door. This one opened into a large, circular chamber with high, domed ceilings. The air here was warmer, tinged with the metallic scent of blood. The arena. Riley's pulse quickened as she was shoved inside, the door ceiling shut behind her. The chamber was empty, save for scattered debris, twisted metal scraps and shards of glass. High above, alien faces peered down from observation windows. She could feel their eyes on her, watching, judging. A deep rumble shook the floor, and Riley turned toward the source of the sound. A section of the wall slid open, revealing a massive creature that stepped into the arena with a low, guttural growl. It was unlike anything she'd ever seen, four-legged, with thick, armored scales and serrated mandibles dripping with venom. Riley's instincts took over. She darted to the side as the creature charged, its massive claws slamming into the ground where she'd stood a moment before. She didn't scream, didn't cry out. Instead, she analyzed its movements, noting the way its body shifted as it prepared to strike. Her training kicked in. Her instructors had drilled her endlessly on reading an opponent, finding their weaknesses. This creature was no different. It was strong but slow, relying on brute force rather than precision. She spotted a jagged metal rod among the debris and sprinted toward it, narrowly dodging another swipe of the creature's claws. Grabbing the rod, she turned to face her opponent. "Come on!" she muttered, raising the makeshift weapon. The creature lunged, and Riley rolled beneath its bulk, jamming the rod into a gap between its armored plates. The creature roared in pain, thrashing wildly as green ichor oozed from the wound. Riley didn't hesitate. She scrambled onto its back, using the rod to leverage herself higher. The creature bucked, trying to shake her off, but she clung on with fierce determination. She found another gap in its armor, near the base of its neck, and drove the rod in deep. With a final, agonized roar, the creature collapsed, its body twitching before going still. Riley rolled off, landing hard on the ground. Her chest heaved as she caught her breath, her hands trembling from the effort. She looked up at the observation window, meeting the gazes of her captors. "You've underestimated me," she said, her voice cold and steady. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the Zicterans began to chatter, their voices a mix of confusion and intrigue. Riley didn't wait for them to decide what to do next. She scanned the arena for anything she could use, a vent, a weak spot in the walls. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to escape. And they wouldn't see it coming. Turning the tables. Riley crouched in the shadow of a tall, curved pillar, her eyes scanning the room for threats. Her chest still ached from the chaos of the arena, but she couldn't afford to slow down. After her victory, she'd been dragged to another part of the ship, a facility that looked like a training area, but for what purpose, she could only guess. The room was enormous, with alien machines humming along the walls and metallic crates scattered haphazardly. It was quieter here, the kind of quiet that felt too deliberate. The Zicterans had started moving her through the ship after her display in the arena. Clearly, she'd proven herself worthy of further observation, but Riley knew better than to believe she'd earned their respect. She was a tool to them, a pawn in whatever twisted experiment they were running. A sharp clicking sound echoed nearby, and Riley ducked lower, pressing herself against the cool metal surface of the pillar. 2 Zicteran guards entered the room, their heavy footfalls resonating through the floor. "Subject displays enhanced combat capability," one of them rasped, their translator device turning the alien clicks into words. The other let out a low, guttural laugh. "It's just a child. Amusing how these humans fight so hard for such fragile lives." Riley's fist clenched, but she stayed silent, her breathing controlled. She couldn't afford to let anger cloud her judgment. Instead, she watched their movements, noting the path they took across the room and the slight delay in the swiveling of their head-mounted sensors. When they were gone, she slipped out from her hiding place, her footsteps silent on the smooth floor. She had to move carefully. Every corner of this ship was a potential trap, and every action she took had to serve a purpose. Information was her weapon, and she intended to use it well. Riley made her way to a console embedded in the wall. The screen glowed faintly, covered in symbols she couldn't fully decode yet, but she'd been studying them since her capture. The Zicteran's language was complicated, but patterns were emerging, patterns she could exploit. As her fingers hovered over the console, a quiet voice startled her. "You're going to get caught." Riley spun, her makeshift blade, a shard of alien metal she'd scavenged, gripped tightly in her hand. The voice belonged to another captive, a young alien child with pale, iridescent skin and wide, amber eyes. It stood a few paces away, watching her curiously. "Who are you?" Riley whispered, her grip on the blade not relaxing. "My name is Erix," the child said, its voice soft and musical. "I've been here longer than you. If you keep sneaking around like that, they'll find you." Riley studied Erix carefully, trying to determine if it was a threat. It didn't look like one. Its frame was small and thin, its movements hesitant. If anything, it seemed more scared than she was. "Why are you talking to me?" Riley asked. Erix tilted its head, amber eyes shimmering. "Because you're different. The others, they just give up. But you fought back. You made them notice." Riley lowered the blade slightly but didn't put it away. "Noticed or not, I'm not staying here. Do you know anything about this place?" Erix glanced nervously at the doorway, then back at Riley. "I know enough. I know how they control the ship. I know where they keep the others." Riley's heart skipped at the mention of others. "Humans?" "Some," Erix said, nodding. "But most are from other worlds. They experiment on all of us. We're just projects to them." Riley tightened her grip on the blade. Her mind raced, piecing together the information. If there were others, then she couldn't just think about escaping. She had to find a way to disrupt the Zicterans' plans entirely. "Can you help me?" Riley asked, her voice firm but low. Erix hesitated, glancing around nervously. "Maybe. But if they catch me..." "They won't," Riley interrupted, her tone sharp. "We don't have time for hesitation. If you know something, tell me. Or stay here and wait for them to experiment on you again." The alien child flinched but nodded slowly. "The control room. It's where they monitor everything. If you can get there, you might be able to disrupt their systems. But it's heavily guarded." Riley nodded, already forming a plan. She needed distraction, something big enough to draw attention away from her infiltration. Hours later, Riley and Erix crept through the dimly lit corridors of the ship. The alien child moved with surprising agility, leading her through back routes and maintenance tunnels that bypassed most of the guards. Along the way, Erix explained more about the ship's layout, its weak points, and the routines of the Zicteran patrols. They reached a large lab filled with rows of glowing containment pods. Riley's stomach turned as she realized the pods were filled with unconscious captives, their bodies suspended in viscous, greenish liquid. "This is where they keep them before the experiments," Erix whispered. Riley approached one of the pods, her hand brushing against the cold glass. The human inside, a woman in her 20s, looked pale and lifeless, but faint movement in her chest indicated she was still alive. "We have to free them," Riley said. Erix shook its head. "We can't. Not now. If you open the pods, alarms will go off. Then we'll come back for them," Riley said firmly. "But we're not leaving anyone behind." Erix hesitated but nodded. As they moved deeper into the ship, they encountered their first real obstacle, a pair of guards stationed outside a large, reinforced door. Riley crouched behind a crate, studying the guards' movements. "They're blocking the way to the control room," Erix whispered. Riley glanced at her companion, then at the environment around them. "Stay here," she said. "What are you going to do?" Erix asked, its voice tinged with fear. "Make some noise," Riley replied, a grim smile tugging at her lips. She moved quickly, grabbing a loose piece of machinery and hurling it down the corridor. The clattering noise echoed loudly, drawing the guards' attention. As they moved toward the source of the sound, Riley slipped behind them, her steps silent and deliberate. With precise movements, she disabled one of the guards, using her makeshift blade to strike at the exposed joints of its armor. The second guard turned, but Riley was faster. She ducked under its swing and drove her blade into the base of its neck, just as she'd done with the creature in the arena. The guards collapsed, and Riley motioned for Erix to follow. They slipped through the door and into the control room. The space was dominated by holographic displays, each one showing different sections of the ship. Riley quickly identified the central console and began working. "Can you lock them out of the system?" she asked Eric's, who stood nervously by the door. "I can try," the alien said, moving to another terminal. As Eric's worked, Riley scanned the screens, searching for anything that could give her an advantage. Then she saw it, a schematic of the ship, showing its power core and the central network hub that controlled the entire vessel. "This isn't just about escaping," she said, her voice steady. "We're going to bring this whole ship down." Eric's looked at her, its eyes wide with a mix of fear and admiration. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Riley replied. "If they think they can mess with humanity, they're about to learn how wrong they are." The sound of alarms cut through the air, and Riley turned toward the door, her jaw tightening. "They know we're here," Eric said. "Good," Riley said, gripping her blade. "Let them come." A blaze of defiance. The control room lights dimmed as the alarms blared, bathing the space in ominous red hues. Riley tightened her grip on her blade, her sharp eyes fixed on the door. Her body was tense, but her mind remained cold and focused. She'd prepared for this moment, and she wasn't going to let fear undo her resolve. Behind her, Eric's frantically worked at the console, their nimble fingers flying across the alien symbols. The small alien's amber eyes darted nervously to Riley. "I've disabled part of their surveillance and locked some doors, but they'll break through soon." "They always do." Riley glanced over her shoulder, her voice calm but firm. "How long until we can override the power core controls?" "I don't know," Eric admitted, frustration lacing their tone. "It's not designed to be accessed from here." "I'm trying, but—" "You're doing great," Riley interrupted, her voice steady and sure. "Just keep going. I'll handle the rest." A pounding sound echoed through the corridor outside, followed by the sharp hiss of cutting tools. The Zicterans were already trying to breach the door. Riley shifted her stance, scanning the room for anything that could serve as a makeshift weapon or trap. Her gaze landed on a cylindrical power conduit humming faintly against the wall. She grabbed it, wrenching it free with a grunt. The device emitted a low whine, sparking faintly at one end. It wasn't much, but it would do. The door hissed and groaned as the Zicterans began forcing their way inside. Eric's looked up, panic flashing across their face. "They're coming!" "I know," Riley replied, her voice cool as ice. She positioned herself near the entrance, holding the sparking conduit like a staff. With a final shriek of tearing metal, the door gave way, and 2 Zicteran guards stormed in. Their glowing eyes locked on Riley, mandibles clicking in fury. Riley didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, swinging the conduit in a sharp arc. The first guard raised its baton to block, but the force of her blows sent sparks flying. She twisted her body, ducking under a retaliatory swipe, and drove the sparking end of the conduit into the guard's side. The creature let out a guttural screech, collapsing in a heap as its exoskeleton smoked and crackled. The second guard moved faster, its claws slashing through the air, but Riley rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack. "Behind you!" Eric shouted. Riley pivoted just in time to see a third Zicteran entering the room, its energy weapon aimed squarely at her. Thinking fast, she grabbed the first guard's fallen baton and hurled it with all her strength. The weapon struck the newcomer's arm, knocking its aim off as it fired. A searing beam of energy grazed the wall, leaving a smoldering scar. Riley closed the distance, leaping onto the guard and jamming the sparking conduit into its neck. The Zicteran spasmed violently before collapsing. She turned to the remaining guard, who hesitated, clearly calculating whether it wanted to face her wrath. Riley didn't give it a chance to decide. She darted forward, driving her blade into the soft joint at its shoulder. With a final, pained screech, the creature crumpled to the floor. Breathing heavily, Riley wiped a smear of greenish ichor from her face. She turned to Eric's, who was staring at her with wide, disbelieving eyes. "That should buy us a little time," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "How's it going on your end?" I think I've got it," Eric's exclaimed, their voice tinged with excitement. I can redirect the power core's overload sequence from here. But once I do, we'll only have minutes before the entire ship destabilizes. Perfect, Riley said, nodding. Get it done. I'll figure out how to get us out of here. Eric's hesitated, glancing at the unconscious prisoners displayed on the monitors. What about them? We can't just leave them behind. We're not, Riley said firmly. Is there any way to unlock their pods remotely? Eric's fingers flew across the console as they searched for an answer. After a moment, they nodded. I can release them, but it'll trigger another alert. The Zicterans will know immediately. Do it, Riley said without hesitation. I'll hold them off as long as I can. Eric's pressed a sequence of symbols, and a shrill alarm filled the air. On the monitors, Riley watched as the containment pods began to open, their greenish liquid draining away. The prisoners inside stirred weakly, some collapsing to the floor while others slowly regained their footing. Go! Riley barked, pointing toward the nearby ventilation shaft. Help guide them to the escape pods. I'll meet you there. Eric's looked at her, fear and admiration warring in their expression. You're not coming with me, are you? I will, Riley said, her voice firm. But first, I've got to make sure these bastards don't recover from this. Eric's hesitated for a heartbeat before nodding. Don't die, human! Not planning to, Riley replied with a faint smirk. The small alien disappeared through the shaft, leaving Riley alone in the control room. She turned back to the console, her mind racing. She had one final task, to ensure the Zicterans couldn't stop the power core's overload. As she worked, more guards began pouring into the room. Riley fought like a whirlwind, her movements precise and relentless. She used every weapon at her disposal, the sparking conduit, the guards' fallen batons, even the environment itself. She ducked and weaved, outmaneuvering her larger, slower opponents. For every Zicteran she took down, two more seemed to appear, but Riley didn't falter. She was no longer just fighting for herself, she was fighting for the prisoners, for Eric's, and for every human the Zicterans had ever abducted. Finally, with a deafening roar, the power core began to destabilize. The ship trembled violently, its walls shuddering as the energy buildup reached critical levels. Riley grinned despite the chaos. She'd done it. She turned and sprinted for the ventilation shaft, her legs burning with effort. The corridors were a blur as she raced toward the escape pods, dodging falling debris and disoriented guards. When she reached the docking bay, Eric's was waiting, waving frantically. Hurry! Riley dove into the nearest pod just as the ship's structure began to collapse. Eric's hit the launch sequence, and the pod shot out into the void of space, leaving the Zicteran vessel behind. Through the pod's viewport, Riley watched as the massive ship erupted in a brilliant explosion, its fiery remains scattering into the darkness. She leaned back in her seat, her chest heaving as the adrenaline began to fade. Eric sat beside her, their small frame trembling with exhaustion. You did it, Eric said softly, their voice filled with awe. No, Riley replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. We did it. The two sat in silence, watching the stars stretch endlessly before them. They were alive. For now, that was enough.